So what happens when you're a pipe? Well, God does great things, and God has shown us in the last 30 years of pastoral ministry that God prepared us for unique ministry. I kind of reached a plateau in my ministry because I was sitting at my office, and it was October of 2015, I think it was, and I got a phone call, and they called, and they says, we've been looking at you online, and we've decided you have 10 good years left, and it's time for you to do something significant. That's what they said on the phone. And see, when you're in ministry like I am, I mean, I started out in a little church of 300, and then a church of 600 called me, and then I went from that to a church of 1,200, and then a church of 2,500, and that's just what you do. And I was at the 2,500, and this was one of those 5,000 ones. And they said, this is a big ministry. We'll even pay you double. I was already paid way too much, and they were going to double it. And I went home to Bonnie, and I said, I just learned two things. I only have 10 years left to live. And that I've never done anything significant. And we were just coming off one of the most amazing times in our life where we were ministering to people that were so poor they had electricity, but they couldn't afford the light bulbs. And so in Bonnie's session, they kept pushing her toward the windows so that she could teach longer, and they went all afternoon. And nobody was worried about the time. I spoke an hour, and they said, what are you doing? The service is 2 hours long. I said, you guys sit for 2 hours? I was saying that to the translator. He says, yeah. I said, well, I can go as long as you want. And I went, and they had a 15, 20-minute break, another 2 hours. And I thought, boy, we don't have that in America. There is an insatiable hunger to be taught the Word of God for these first-generation believers. And so Bonnie and I realized that equipping and mobilizing, especially the Great Commission partners to reach those least reached peoples of Asia and Europe. And so I'd like to show you, if it works, boom, what we do. By the way, this is the spiritual resume I had to give Calvary Bible Church. I pastored them for almost 10 years. I had to fill out more paperwork to apply to be a missionary for my home church than I did to become the senior pastor. But basically, they had us do a spiritual resume of why we believe God called us into missions. And I said, I've been involved in missions since 1977 when I started as a pastor. This is our prayer card. They're at the back. Any of you that would like one, they'll be available. I didn't know Paul was going to let me put them out there, so I only brought 20 of them. But they're sitting back there. But for any of you that would like one, if they're gone, then I will show you in just a moment my email address. But why would we go into missions? Why would I pass up do something significant in my life and just pastor a bigger, more multi-million-dollar ministry with more staff? It's to maximize the impact of the gospel. I think that America has come to the Laodicean age where most Americans, not you, you're here, you're suffering with the mosquitoes and the rain. But most American Christians are rich and increased with goods and don't really need much of anything. And they're shopping for churches. They're looking for the best music program and the best youth program. They're paying someone else to win the lost, and they come and critique, and a lot of them aren't even happy with their church, and most of their coworkers don't even know they're a believer or their fellow students. That's where America, by and large, has gotten. Now, you're abnormal, but I'm talking about, I crisscross the country. I'm all over the country, and I will tell you that vibrant, connected, sharing, community, evangelizing, sanctified believers are not common in America. We're rich. We're increased with goods. And Christ said that the care of riches makes our heart grow cold. And so missions maximizes the impact of the gospel. And I just want to share 3 examples. In the book of Acts, one of the patterns we see is people come and say all that God has done through them. See, God uses people, but God is doing great things. And we're able to just see a little bit of it. One thing is, Bonnie and I, 2 years ago, went to a Mexican church planners conference. It was the most amazing event. That's the one where they kept pushing her by the window. And when we got there, I said, who are these people? A foundation paid for me to come and bust all of them there. Many of them rode 17 hours, 21 hours, 23 hours on buses from rural Mexican villages. And they came to this training center that was dormitories. All the families, 250 families were there. And I said, wow. And it was in a city that's amazing. I shouldn't even tell you this. The place where we met is where they grow cilantro. Do any of you go to places that use cilantro? That's the big thing in Mexican restaurants. And when we got out of the car from the airport, I went, what is that smell? And they said, our town makes cilantro, and cilantro grows best on ground that has been destroyed by mining. And so this is the silver mining town outside of Mexico City, up in the mountains, on the side of the bowl. And they had taken the silver mining stuff and thrown it on the surface, and it looked like the moon. Nothing grew there. It was just all the byproducts of silver mining with all the chemicals and everything. And they said, so what we do is we make dikes all the way around these big moon-like fields, and Mexico City trucks up the sewer from Mexico City, and they flood these that looks like the polders of Netherlands, and then when it soaks in, they said cilantro grows like mad. I went, oh, wow, that really makes me love Mexican food. And they said, yeah, we had a problem. They said, we had a problem. They said, there was this food contagion outbreak in America, and so they started inspecting our field, and the inspector came out to our cilantro field from America, flew in, from one of the big buyers, and he went, it was unannounced. And he said, what are all those white flecks on all the plants? And they said, we hadn't had time to hose the field down. It was toilet paper on the plants. But they hose it down before they send it to America. So that was where we were meeting. And so we were meeting in the middle of sewer in this place with no light bulbs. And I said, remind me again why I'm speaking here. And they said, these 250 Mexican church planters are inveterate church planting evangelists, and they get up at sunrise, and they visit and go from door to door and share the gospel. The wives are doing slum ministry with children and just doing everything they can. And the problem is, the mission director said, most of their children are not Christians because the parents hardly are close. They're married legally, but they rarely spend time together, and there's no love shown between them. And they certainly don't have time for their children. So they said, we've decided to call them all in for 1 week, and we want you. And they had found online this little card that is the Ephesians 5, 7 qualities of what a godly husband is like and a godly wife, if I can find it in my wallet. I probably gave it away. But I have it right here. Here it is. And it's just a normal little Bible study from Ephesians 5 that says, in Ephesians 5, husband, number 1, wants to love his wife and give himself to her today. And he actually affirms that and asks his wife, in what way is he not giving himself to her today? And then he says, I want to spend time in the Word and prayer so our marriage is sanctified and cleansed each day. And I want you to be all that God has gifted and called and prepared. It's just basically what Ephesians 5 said a husband is. And they said, we found that translated into Spanish. Will you teach that to our group? I said, I'd love to teach it to your group. So I had a translator, and there were about twice as many as here, spread out. Translator here. And I said, okay, tell them all to get their cards. So they all got their card. Everybody was happy. They had their Spanish card, and they were standing there. I said, okay, now I am going to read this, and I want you to translate it, and then I want them to stand up and turn and repeat it to their wife. So I read, I want you to be all that God has gifted and called and prepared for you to be, and I'm going to work alongside you for that goal. And the translator said, right now? In English. I said, mm-hmm. He said, them? I said, mm-hmm. He said, out loud? I was feeling some hesitation there. So I looked at the group, and I use motions. I don't speak Spanish. I said, and so they all stood up, and I went, your wife, face. And so the guy... So I got all the pastors. These are career pastors. These are born-again servants of the Lord. Husbands and wife facing each other. I said, take your card and read the first bullet point and put your wife's name in there. And say, I want Bonnie. I want to love you, Bonnie, as my wife. And I want to give myself to you today. As I had them go through that 1 point at a time. It wasn't more than the third point when in the auditorium we did have lights, not in the meeting rooms. And I could see from the light the trickle, the light glinting off tears all over the room, running down women's faces. On the first break, Bonnie and I were both mobbed by these Mexican servants of the Lord who said, one woman told me, she said, my husband's been married to me for 30 years. He's never said anything like that to me in 30 years. She said, I don't care if he meant it or not. Just to hear him say those words was the most transforming thing of our marriage. And that was the first session. We studied all the 7 characteristics of a Christ-reflecting husband. And then you know what's the killer? A woman. The husband is supposed to play the part of Christ. The woman in the marriage is supposed to play the part of the church. And the church responds to Christ. And so then we went through the 7 Ephesians 5 qualities. And you know what one of them is? That a woman says that I want to, and you go through all the things that the church does. We submit to Christ and we follow Christ and we trust Christ and we love Christ and we cherish Christ and all that. And a woman says aloud to her husband that I want you to be, as Titus 2 says, my very best friend in the world. Closer than my mother, closer than my sisters, closer than my children, closer than my friends. How many women affirm that to their husband? How many men say that you're more important to me than my hobbies and my car I'm restoring and my hunting that I do religiously and, my everything else, my basketball league and my volleyball league and my bowling league and my blah, 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 blah. And see, all of a sudden, in 1 week, those 250 Mexican church planters, I'll show you their faces. They're just amazing. They're normal people. They said, we didn't even know. Marriage was just a legal contract so that we could get married and have legitimate kids. They said we never really explored the oneness in Christ. And by the way, in English, Paul invited me to do the exact same seminar here the second week of September. The Ephesians 5, I don't know what it's called. Romance Weekend? What is it called? Married Couples Retreat. And we're going to cover Ephesians 5, men and women. And if you come, you're going to face your wife and actually say those things to her, and she might cry too. The second amazing moment was we were at a conference in Eritrea, and there were 700 doctors there, and I was just preaching through the Lord's Prayer, because I always preach whatever I'm doing at church, and I was preaching through the Lord's Prayer, and I was doing the deliver us from the evil one. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And I said, in spiritual warfare is like this, and this is how it works, and this is da-da-da-da. And as I was going through, the break came, and a doctor came up to me in scrubs. That's how they are at these conferences. They're real doctors. They're going to medical training. They come to the Bible hour. They set up appointments, and they go to the Q&A at night. And they are just busy. And one of them came up to me and he said, I want you to know, he was 30. Most of the doctors, the next generation, these people on the front lines, most of them are in their 30s. I can't believe it. It's not like they didn't make it as a doctor, or it's not like that they're worn out and they finally are going to cut back and go and be a doctor overseas. These guys are at the ascendancy of their careers. They've just gotten out of med school, they've started into practice, and they feel a call to use that gift on the front lines. And they're resigning from Harvard, medical school, or from, Johns Hopkins, or from the Mayo Clinic, where I met 40 of them from the Mayo Clinic, and they're resigning from the treadmill of earning $300,000 and $400,000 and $500,000 a year and trying to keep up, with all the materialism of America. And they said, we would rather invest our lives where the gospel's never been preached. And so one of them came to me, and he was one of those, and he was from Cleveland, actually, a gifted surgeon. And he said, you're in my book. I said, what does that mean? I mean, do people walk up to you and say, you're in my book, and is it a joke? What are you saying? And he was wearing his scrubs, and he reached in his back pocket, and he pulled out that little tiny 3x5 moleskin, and he said, I'm a doctor on the line in a Muslim country next to the ISIS territory. He said, there's a constant battle between the American troops and the Allied, whatever, the Sunni Arabs against. And he says, our field hospital is always stitching and sewing up all the casualties. He said, and I'm there serving the Lord so that all the Samaritan's Purse and other people can be given out the gospel. He says, and I share the gospel when I can, but I'm working this mission hospital. He said, the problem is, we live on the the base where all the soldiers are. We're safe there. But he says, we have to leave there, and I have to drive and drop my kids off at the mission school that's also in that country. And he said, then I have to drive to the hospital to work 12 hours a day, and then I drive back and pick them up, and I go back to the base where it's safe. And he said, there are no road signs, and it's all Arabic. And he says, I live in dread fear of straying into ISIS territory. They don't have barbed wire. It's just what they're controlling, where they're hiding out and shooting. And he said, because of that, and he showed me By the way, this is his team, but I had to block it out because I'm afraid that it would get online. This is the market. He said they bring the food to us in pickup trucks. Whatever, a cow, a camel, a donkey, a horse, a dog, whatever it is, he said. And they just drive up, and he said his wife has to point at what she wants, and they take out a cleaver and go whack, and they just throw it in the yard. And she has to scrape off the dirt, pull out the hide, get the bone shards, wash it off with water that was delivered this way on a donkey in a big, rubber bladder that they put into pails. They let the dirt, go down. Then they have to boil it so that it is, drinkable. And she washes off that and cuts all the meat off the bones and has to can it because they don't have refrigeration. How'd you like to live that way? Instead of having cellophane over USDA prime cut. But he said, between surviving with that water and the meat hacking with bone chips that you hope you're not at the end of the truck ride where the meat's been out in the sun for 8 hours and it's already, starting to rot. But he said, I live in dread fear that my 3 stair-step daughters, who all had blonde hair, I met them, 6'4", blue eyes, blonde hair. He said, if I stray into ISIS territory, they'd just rape my wife. But he said they would sell my 3 daughters. They sell them to whoever wants to buy them at a market. They sell the captive. Remember the Yadsi girls? All the ones in Iraq that were auctioned off? That's what they still do. And so he said, I'm driving, and he says, as I drop my kids off at the school and turn around and go to the hospital, he said, fear starts creeping in. He says, and I'll get doing my surgeries, and I'm at the table, and he says, all of a sudden, he said, it feels just like black ink coming down on me. And he said, I can't even do surgery. He said, because I'm afraid. I'm saying, what are you doing here? Why aren't you back in Cleveland, where you could live in a gated community and, go fish all the time and have fun and play golf? He said, what are you doing subjecting your daughters to being almost sold every day if you skirt into the ISIS territory? He said, what are you doing? And he said, the darkness comes, and he says, I can't even think. And he said, so what I do is I go to the only locked room in the whole hospital, the bathroom. He said, I turn the lock, and that's when he pulled out that book. And he says, I take this. He said, this is my book. And I listen to the gospel and to the Bible being preached. And when someone preaches on a verse that connects by the Spirit of God in my heart, and I have hope, and I see that as something that could overcome the darkness when it's drowning me, he said, I write that verse down. And he said, then I write a prayer to the Lord applying that verse. He said, this morning, he said, about 5 minutes into whatever it was you were talking about, you did one of those verses. He said, I spent the rest of the hour working in my book. He said, what did you speak on, by the way? I didn't hear the rest. But he said, I got that one verse, and he said, you're in my book. And I thought, I don't think I could do what he's doing. Could you? Would you do that? Women, would you scrape hair and bone chips and dirt off of meat thrown in your yard and cut it up and can it for your family with water that came on a burro? While your husband drives through ISIS territory with your 3 blonde-haired, blue-eyed daughters? And he could live in Cleveland in a 6,000-square-foot house? See, that's why we have hope for the gospel getting to the nations. There are people that are giving up everything to go. But the problem is when they go, they're bringing with them all the problems they had in America. Those couples are not perfect. They're just fearless. And they still have marriage struggles. They still have parenting struggles. They still have personal struggles. They still have spiritual warfare. They still are trying to put all the pieces together to learn how to walk in the Spirit on a daily basis. But they have absented themselves from church. Because where that one lives, their church is, they listen to cassettes. Who even knows what cassettes are anymore? He said they use CDs. They can't stream video because they're so remote. I mean, they're actually doing this for the Lord, but it's harming them. And so it was our privilege to, spend time and talk to him about how to overcome the darkness. And I already told you the Wycliffe surgeon thing, the one that was bitter. The little dots up there are the unreached and unengaged people groups. You can see where they're clustered across sub-Saharan Africa, they're around the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, which we know is India, Southeast Asia. There are a few up there in Europe and Central Asia. Over the last 36 months, Bonnie and I have personally worked with 1,000 of them. 1,000 of these career missionaries working in closed countries. And we have counseled them and discipled them and mentored them and nurtured them. Calvary gave me 10 weeks a year to do this. What a blessing. But it got to be one too many times that I flew into O'Hare at 2 a.m. Sunday morning, drove to Calvary, preached, and left after the evening service to do another one. And Bonnie said, "You are burning both ends of the candles." And I said, "Yes." And so the church is sending us out to do this full time. If you would like one of our cards, my address is info@dtbm.org for John and Bonnie.